Hello, and welcome to the Daily Objective brought to you by the Ayn Rand Centre UK. Today, I'm joined once again by a very busy man, James Valliant. I know you just did duty a little bit earlier this morning, and welcome back. It's good to chat with you again.
Well, thank you. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, sir. And we've got another good discussion, I think, coming up today.
I believe so. In some ways, our discussion today is a follow-up on some themes that we touched on a couple of days ago, where we talked about racial stereotyping and offensive speech. I want to begin by delimiting the topic and considering certain situations where I think freedom of speech, freedom of expression does not apply properly. One, of course, is in the case of fraud, the attempt to gain a value from someone through deception, in which case the victim is acting against his rational judgment, acting against his interests. We can agree that freedom of expression does not apply in that case. Another such scenario would be defamation of character, which is ruining somebody's reputation, using speech to ruin somebody's reputation. And then a third situation, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, it's just the three examples that popped into my mind, would be any form of incitement to violence. An extreme example of which would be the Ayatollah Khamenei and his fatwa against Salman Rushdie. But any situation where someone is inciting violence or prejudice against an individual, against a group, the question of freedom of speech simply does not apply. But where I disagree with the common interpretation of these scenarios is many people will say, well, see, that proves that freedom of speech is limited or restricted. And I say, absolutely not. I think that's a very poor conceptualization. Strictly speaking, freedom of expression is an absolute, but nobody can claim the right to use speech to violate the rights of another or to urge somebody else to be deprived of their rights and freedoms. Just as in the realm of action, nobody can initiate physical force against someone else, that doesn't mean that our freedom of action is restricted. Our freedom of action is unrestricted in a certain context. The context being that we have to acknowledge the same rights and the same freedoms in other people. So let's take that as our starting point. And can you give us your thoughts on that from an ethical and a legal point of view?
Well, you set the context very nicely there. You really did. The fact is that the way most people look at rights is that each right is sort of a separate and discrete thing. We've got freedom of speech over here, freedom of religion over here, and they separate our freedoms into different categories as if they're in isolation from one another. So this right is in competition with this right. So, for example, you say many of the examples you give, like overt threats. If there's an overt threat against a person, wait a minute, they've got a right not to, Salman Rushdie has a right not to get assassinated because of a fatwa. He doesn't have a right to life and not get murdered or hurt even, have an eye put out even. Excuse me, it does still get me upset. But on the other hand, don't we have to balance out the other person's freedom of speech to issue the fatwa? I do not look at rights as a balancing act. I do not look at rights as being in conflict with one another. I regard, like Ayn Rand, rights to be a conceptual unified whole. When you understand the source of all rights, you understand how each of these rights interplay with each other. So, you set it up beautifully. Let's take your first example, fraud. What's happening in a case of fraud is I am taking most lies should be legal, right? If I just lie to you, the lie as such is legal. So in that sense, I have freedom of speech even to lie. So when do lies become the business of the law properly? Well, if I'm lying to you to get you to involuntarily give me your physical property, then it's a form of theft. I'm physically taking your property against your will. So it's not the speech as such that's the problem. It's the fact that I'm taking your physical property against your will that makes it the problem, you see. And you can go down what are regarded as, in my country, the United States Supreme Court has carved out what they view as sort of exceptions. They regard freedom of speech as a fundamental right that basically is almost impossible to overcome. But they have carved out some exceptions. The exceptions to these include, for example, fraud, as you've said, threats, as you pointed out. Even in the case of threats, though, let me give you an example. If I am soliciting you to commit a crime, if I'm engaged in a conspiracy with you to commit a crime, it's that crime. It's not the talking that we do beforehand. I offer you $1 million to kill Salman Rushdie. That's a solicitation to commit murder. Now, in cases of attempt, solicitation, conspiracy, threats, all of these have to be judged contextually. Is it one that would be credible, this threat? Is it something that would be immediate in its application? Is it right now threat? Is it a physical force threat? And so it has to meet all these imminency, credibility, physical force, and only when it meets these requirements. Furthermore, with these solicitations, say to commit murder or conspiracy to commit murder, I have to take an act in furtherance along to commit that crime, like an attempted commission. There has to be something more than just the words for it to be a crime. And so these really aren't exceptions at all in my mind to freedom of speech. They're just simply speech being involved in a wider crime. Talking can be part of a crime. And when talking is part of a crime, it's the crime that's the problem, not the talking in isolation. And that's the distinction that I'd make. The same is true with fraud as with, say, copyright violations, plagiarism. In effect, I'm stealing your words and the money you're making from those words against the law, against your will. In effect, it's a kind of theft, of taking a physical property against the will of the proper owner. And so in all of those cases, I do not see them as exceptions to free speech. I am a free speech absolutist. When it comes to speech as such, the speech there should be no limits on it because it doesn't involve an actual attempt at physical taking or harm, which is the line, of course, for us objectivists.
Right. So let's take this one step further. So setting aside any cases of incitement to violence or incitement to commit a crime, are there certain situations where a certain kind of speech is so offensive that it's justified for the law to get involved? And an example that often comes up is Holocaust denial. So I have two particular cases that I would like to examine. And let's begin with the Chomsky-Faurisson affair. So Robert Faurisson was a British-born French academic. He was a professor of literature who denied that there were gas chambers in Auschwitz. He denied that the Jews were systematically exterminated by the Nazis. There was a controversial case in the very late 70s where Noam Chomsky signed a petition essentially urging that Faurisson's freedom of expression should be protected, even though what he has to say is horrible and despicable, that it should still be protected by the law. There was a case where Faurisson was actually forced to step down from a teaching position, and the school, I think, argued, well, we couldn't really guarantee his safety, or we couldn't guarantee his protection from violence, so he was made to step down. And the interesting thing about this incident is that Chomsky was criticized on both sides of the ocean by the French and by Americans, saying, you'll see, he's aiding and abetting a Holocaust denier. Some people even said that Chomsky himself is a Holocaust denier, ignoring the fact that he is of Jewish descent, which is a little bit ridiculous. Consequence of this was that Chomsky was not invited to speak in France for a period of about 3 decades. His books were not translated into French until long after 2000. So for being a consistent and principled defender of freedom of speech, he himself was attacked. So can we talk a little bit about that?
Well, there can be little doubt. I am totally on Professor Chomsky's side here, and that is a red letter day for me. I find myself generally in strong disagreement with so many of the things that Chomsky says, but here he's absolutely right. I am not a Holocaust denier. 6 million Jews were slaughtered intentionally and systematically by the Nazis. The physical evidence is overwhelming. It is one of the most horrific events in human history. It is, to deny it is so deeply offensive. I personally know people who survived the death camps and know people who survived Nazi Germany. It's not a joke to me. And so it's as offensive to me as it possibly can be. But fortunately, the United States Supreme Court agrees with Professor Chomsky here. They have never carved out, of all those exceptions that I talked about, they have never carved out an exception for hate speech as such. In the United States, fortunately, there is no limit on how offensive the speech can be as such. Offensiveness as such is not relevant at all. Freedom of speech must include my ability to offend and offend deeply. You can't, anything else is not free speech. Now, is it demonstrably false? It's overwhelmingly demonstrably false about the Holocaust. Yes. Is it tremendously hurtful? Could people be emotionally deeply affected by it? Absolutely. But there's this huge thing here. Sticks and stones can really break my bones, but words are entirely different. Being offended is of a different category than physically hurting someone. There's Bill Maher was talking about this on his show, another person I don't always agree with, talking about the show, but he made it on his show, and he made a really, really great point. He said this drummer from this rock band had to issue a public apology for supporting a book that he had read. I think it was on the transgender issue. And he publicly apologized for reading the book, saying, I didn't realize the harm that this book was causing, and the harm that my reading the book was causing. Bill Maher had a great response. Harm? Only if he picked up and hit the drummer over the head with the book. We have to distinguish sharply between physical harms and physical takings and offense. And at no degree of stupidity, error, offensiveness. In this sense, I'm a free speech absolutist all the way. And fortunately, the Supreme Court in my country, unlike Great Britain and Germany, which in my view do have the equivalent of hate speech laws, America is still, fortunately, at least for now, a bastion, the greater bastion of free speech.
Yeah, and I think that's one difference still between the United States and Europe. Now, there's an interesting, actually two interesting postscripts to the Foresson affair. In 1980, Foresson published a book called Mémoire et Défense, or his publisher. It was a collection of essays by Foresson, and they included as a preface a short article by Chomsky on freedom of expression, but without Chomsky's consent or permission. And this put Chomsky in a difficult position. He actually did request that the preface be taken out, but he still affirmed his commitment to Foresson's freedom of speech and freedom of expression, even though he didn't want that particular essay to be involved in that book.
Sure sounds like the position I would have taken on the matter. I would not want to sanction these Holocaust deniers in any way, and I would take whatever positive steps I could so that my words or my work would not be, if there was anything I could do about it, helping or sanctioning these monstrous Holocaust deniers. On the other hand, I would repeat my point. They have, even though I have a right not to sanction it, and I sure as heck ain't going to sanction it. But on the other hand, they have a right to be just as ignorant, offensive, stupid as they can possibly be.
And the point that Chomsky has made on numerous occasions, if we don't uphold freedom of speech for people that we find despicable, then we don't believe in freedom of speech at all. And Chomsky has quoted, there's that famous statement that's often been misattributed to Voltaire. I don't agree with what you say, but I would die for your right to say it. And he's repeated that on numerous occasions. One last comment about Foresson. There was an incident in 1989 where he was walking his dog in a park, and he was assaulted by three young men. He was badly beaten. His jaw was broken. Apparently, the three young men, they called themselves the Sons of the Memory of the Jews or something to that effect. So this is a case where a Holocaust denier was actually assaulted and very seriously beaten and injured because of his outspoken and offensive views.
He was a victim of a crime. I have been in many, as a prosecutor, a public prosecutor in my country for over 17 years, for almost 18 years, the standard jury instruction, whether it's a misdemeanor battery case where I swing and hit you in the face, or whether it's a murder case where I've shot you with a gun, the jury will get this instruction. Words, no matter how offensive, can never justify a crime of violence, can never justify the initiation of force. No words, no matter how offensive, can justify you committing an act of physical violence. So part of me can sympathize with their being frustrated at this liar who's saying offensive things about Jews. I cannot go so far as to say that in any way, shape, or form justifies getting violent. It does not. Make a counter demonstration. Write an op-ed. Write a book refuting this guy. Do podcast, 16 podcasts where you prove what an idiot this guy is. That's the response The response is not to go bash someone's head in because of the words they used. The response is, if you feel it necessary, use more words. Words can meet words. Only force requires force.
Agreed. Agreed. Let's talk a little bit now about the Irving-Lipstadt lawsuit. So this was a case that happened in 1996. David Irving is a well-known British historian, well-known Holocaust denier. He's also denied the existence of the gas chambers, the extermination of Jews. He's claimed that Hitler was maligned by history. In 1996, he sued an American author, Deborah Lipstadt, for defamation because in one of her books, she criticized him for being a Holocaust denier and criticized his history. So he specifically, he took her UK publisher, Penguin Books, to court. And now in the UK, they have a very interesting libel law that it's actually up to the defendant to prove innocence. There's actually I don't know if you would actually call that a presumption of guilt, but the onus is on the defendant in a libel case to prove innocence. So can we talk a little bit about that?
Truth was not even part of a defense for a long time in a defamation case in Great Britain. One of the real things that distinguished American defamation law from British defamation law, at least until quite recently, across the board, was the truth. The truth of your assertion was not a defense to a defamation case. No, in many ways, including the burden of proof and in other ways, defamation cases are a whole lot easier in Great Britain. They don't have, the Supreme Court has very much limited defamation in the United States because of the free speech issue. And so, for example, if it's a politician or a public figure and you're suing for defamation and you're that public figure, you have to be subject to a certain degree of criticism. So you would have to prove that the other person was maliciously, falsely, factually lying about you before you can even get a defamation, and prove the economic harm, by the way, the physical harms in effect that were caused by this, for you to have a defamation case. And I agree with each of those elements. They're vital. They're absolutely vital for a defamation case. And in Great Britain, that's unfortunately still not the case. America has much more freedom of speech. Being criticized for being a monster who denies the Holocaust is something you can say, I can say here in America. And let me just say it. This guy's a monster who denies the Holocaust. And I would urge him to sue me in the United States where I'm making this statement so I can, but I'm sure he won't, knowing the laws in the United States protect me, in calling him an idiot, a jerk, an offensive, ignorant person, on and on and on and on I can go, and that's not defamation. Thank you. It shouldn't and really cannot be.
But tell us what you really think. The Irving-Lipstadt lawsuit was an interesting case because Lipstadt's legal team, or the Penguin Books legal team, actually had to prove that the Holocaust happened. It was literally a case of the Holocaust being put on trial. They had to actually show the physical evidence that, these showers were converted into gas chambers, and this is where they put in the chemicals, and all of this had to be proved. And by the way, for anyone interested in exploring this case a little bit further, there's a really good TED Talk by the real Deborah Lipstadt, where she talks about the case and her experience. And some years ago, there was a really good film called Denial, specifically about this lawsuit, in which Timothy Spall played David Irving and Rachel Weisz played Deborah Lipstadt. A very good movie that I would encourage people to look into. So any thoughts on that? Putting the Holocaust on trial.
Well, I've not seen that film. Now you've made me want to go see that film. But I can understand a context in which the truth of the matter would be put on trial. But, there comes a point where the evidence is so overwhelming that you can it's like the weather. The judge can take judicial notice of it. He can look out the window and say, no, it's not raining right now. I'll take judicial notice. If a point is so well established, in fact, that a judge, it's frankly almost so well established in my mind that, it is like that. But I can understand a context in a libel or slander case in which you would have to prove the truth or falsehood of the thing in question. And in the case of the burden of proof issue in Great Britain, I think it's a slightly different one. But I can conceive of contexts in which, yes, I would have to prove that, in fact, what was being said was true. But In a libel case, what you're saying is you lied to me, and so conceivably you would have to prove the truth of the Holocaust. That by itself doesn't offend me. It seems like something that can easily be proved. I have to say that it is so overwhelming that you have to wonder about the epistemology, the cycle. It's like a giant form of, wow, I didn't even realize it, gaslighting about the gas chambers, and that can't be the test in a legal context. Very often in a legal context, I have to prove what seems obvious.
Yeah. One last comment about Mr. David Irving. There was another case, this was some years after the lawsuit I just mentioned. In 2005, David Irving was arrested in Austria for a speech that he had made some decades earlier. In the late 80s, he'd given some talks or some interviews where he denied the gas chambers at Auschwitz. And in Austria, and this is also the case in Germany, but in those two countries, denying the Holocaust is illegal. It's a crime, a punishable offense. Irving was sentenced to 3 years in prison, and I think he ended up serving something like 13 months of that prison sentence. He's no longer able to return to Austria. The interesting thing is what Deborah Lipstadt, her comment when she was asked about this, she said, "I'm a defender of free speech. I do not agree that people should go to jail for making comments about the Holocaust denial." And she's of Jewish descent herself, and she's written a lot about Holocaust denial. But she made this point that this is not something that should be a criminally punishable offense. You and I talked about this before we went live, that really the whole modern idea of hate speech and making certain types of speech illegal, criminally punishable, that really began after the war. It began in Germany as an attempt to avoid certain forms of radicalization, which lead to anti-Semitism, which lead to Nazism. But so what are the moral and legal implications of this, of actually arresting people and prosecuting people for so-called hate speech, Holocaust denial?
In the wake of World War II, when, for example, Britain and the United States in effect occupied what became West Germany, I can understand a degree of looking, towards the ideology of people, in the sense that gives you an idea of whether these are Nazis that are ready to do something to fight back. In the wake of World War II, that's perfectly reasonable. Let me give you another example. Would it be reasonable for the United States or Great Britain during World War II to have prevented Nazis from advocating Nazism on the streets of London and New York? I think so. When the country is engaged in physical fighting, in effect, against Nazi Germany, right? The infiltration of Nazi propaganda during the war, it seems to me, is the government's business. I would extend that a little bit in the period of occupation, if that makes sense, because that could give them an indication of who the old Nazis were and are they trying to come back and get power again. But once that occupation is over, certainly, and West Germany became its own country, the idea of carrying that forward is just pure censorship. What you do is you go after the person who's trying to be a neo-Nazi taking over the government. It's not someone's ideas that we go after. And in the wake of World War II, frankly, most of the intellectuals who supported Hitler simply got away with it. Most of the intellectuals, most of the whole movie, Judgment at Nuremberg, with the one case where the judges actually got it, most of the judges, mind you, who worked for Nazi Germany kind of got away with it. And so, in effect, what the Allies were saying, I think it was partly politics, too, that was influencing them here. Not a good motive, but I think part of it was, well, these guys are just using words. Now, when it's Nazi Germany, it's not just words. You're supporting the killing of people, the starting of a world war and a systematic Holocaust. So it's not just words, but when the war is all done and settled, there's really no excuse to limit, Nazi material anymore, is there, from being circulated? No justification whatever. And as I say, I don't care how offensive it is. But if you were an intellectual who helped the Nazis, well, I can see. I'm not so sure they should have been so light on them. On the other hand, if all you're doing is talking, and it is in a totally after the war and after the occupation context, I think it's just a violation of free speech.
Well, let's look at another application of these principles. A few weeks ago, you and I had a discussion of the native land claim question in Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. And the question came up, there's a definite movement among some liberals in Canada to have the native residential schools considered a form of genocide. Not only that, but there's even some arguments to consider that denying that the residential school was a form of genocide against Native children should be considered hate speech and should be punishable or criminally prosecutable, which I guess would be bad news for both of us, since
right.
And we
The funny thing is that we were both harsh critics of that very system. It's not as though we were advocating, saying, "Hey, wasn't it wonderful that Canada did this?" No, it was horrible what Canada was doing. But the point is that denying that can't be a matter of criminal law, no matter how offensive, no matter how ignorant, no matter what. The speech itself has to be protected. It is only, as we earlier talked about, is only in case no one's going to complain about speech that everyone agrees with or no one finds offensive. It's the stuff where people have sharp disagreements. It's the stuff where people are offending people. That's when we need to protect free speech. And it's the most offensive speech that is obviously what needs it. All of this stuff about, in my country, at universities, certain language creates unsafe spaces, or that, we were talking about how trigger warnings, are sometimes a good thing to have. They are. Morally speaking, I would have these trigger warnings, but are trigger warnings legally required? Absolutely not. I walked into a film, I'm not prepared for it, something offends me, I don't have a legal claim against the filmmaker. I walked into this theater not knowing what I was going to look at. Being offensive as such can never be a grounds. Being false, being a lie, being misinformation. In my country, for example, the public health authorities during the COVID lockdown were encouraging, now mind you, social media can disassociate and do whatever. That's not censorship. If social media wants to silence, in effect, people who are spreading what they thought was COVID disinformation, they can do that. When the CDC, the United States federal government, is saying, "Oh yeah, that's misinformation, and social media companies should, take steps to protect us from this misinformation," that's what's wrong. The government has no business telling anybody what is misinformation, not misinformation, allowed speech, not allowed speech. Wrong. Misinformation is protected speech. What do we know about the truth? Has our understanding of COVID changed? Didn't the American Center for Disease Control spread a lot of false information? Yes, they sure did. And so when you say we're protecting you from misinformation, what is misinformation? Maybe at the end of the day, we'll find out what was real and what wasn't. So anyone who's preempting, quote, on the grounds of misinformation is just censoring. And there's no justification for it. They're holding back the discovery of truth, not advancing it. I happen to agree with John Stuart Mill on this. The best thing you can do to destroy a bad idea is to give it a megaphone.
And that's exactly what's happened. It's interesting. So you mentioned spreading falsehoods. That's exactly what David Irving was charged with in Austria for spreading false history, or I forget the exact wording, but in essence, that's what he was convicted of, falsifying history.
I'm also a historian. Historians wrestle about what was true and false in history all the time. Now, this is recent history. We had overwhelming physical evidence. I think it's pretty overwhelming that the Holocaust occurred just on an evidentiary basis. But just in the abstract, historical questions and the truth or falsehood of historical questions have to be debatable. Otherwise, we'll make no progress in history. If new ideas, bad ideas, controversial ideas, ideas that only one dude out there is alone and saying can't be said, you will stifle progress in the field of history.
One last point about the native residential schools, and then we'll check in with our super chats. Now, we both agree that a lot of horrible things happen in the residential schools, but morally, does that belong in the same category as what happened to the Armenians under the Turks during World War I? What happened to
No,
the
sir.
Jews under the Germans during World War II? Is the term genocide really applicable in such a case?
See, we got to use words like genocide. If we're going to have the punch, if we want, look, I want the word genocide to have the punch that it should have. The Germans, yeah, and the Turks made systematic efforts to wipe out a certain group of people within their territory. That's genocide. And when there's a systematic effort to wipe out the people of a certain group, we want that, okay? We want that concept to have some meaning. We want that concept to have some punch. If we're going to say that diseases, which wiped out most of the native peoples of North and South America in the wake of Columbus's discovery, is the same as genocide, where no one even knew it would happen. No one had any idea that diseases, that the immunity was such among Native Americans that it would cause them to be wiped out. Now, but that's your closest, to some kind of genocide, because I think it's really unfair to say that policies, either in Canada or the United States, even policies that I strongly, strongly disagree with, and in many cases were extremely harmful, calling that genocide is to devalue the term genocide. I don't think in either country's case they were out to systematically annihilate the natives within their countries. That's what we should reserve the term genocide for, in my view.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let's briefly check in with our producer, Irene. Do we have any comments or super chats at this point?
Yes, we have quite a few. So I'll start with the first one. Phil for £10 says, I hate mustard equals to reality. Murder all mustard makers equals to irrational. It's where the impact is not just subjectively offensive, but incites a direct or potential threat.
Yes. Now, I would still urge caution and make some pretty severe requirements on that. Someone could say that calling me a jerk is an incitement for me to punch them in the face. It sure is not. The incitement itself has to be a threat of force in some way. The incitement itself has to be a threat of force that is imminent and credible. Imminent and credible. Otherwise, then what we'd be doing is stretching that word incitement to mean, in effect, cover offensiveness. We don't want to do that. It's got to be a threat of physical force that is credible and potentially imminent. Otherwise, the government has no business intervening, even in that threat. But yes, in general, I absolutely agree with the distinction you're making there.
Thank you. Gail Parker with $4.99 just sent a sticker. And then we have Jason Adams saying for $5, if we take a country after a war, should we limit the use of symbols and the political parties of the conquered?
See, I happen to think, yeah, well, go ahead.
No, I was saying, but by symbols, I assume you mean like swastikas, Nazi flags, Nazi iconography. Yeah.
I assume so.
I'll go further. During a war, will we allow the enemy that we're fighting on the battlefield to spread his propaganda and recruit members in our own country? Does the United States government or the Canadian government or the British government have a right to prevent people from recruiting for the Nazis in their own country as they're fighting the Nazis? Yeah, I do. And that would include the restriction of the use of symbols. Also, when people are dying in a war, simply if I were to wear a swastika on my arm while people are dying, that's an entirely different context. There was a case where they wanted to build a mosque after 9/11 near the Twin Towers that had been brought down back, in 2002, right after the towers had been brought down. While we're fighting a war with jihadism, I see no problem with the government restricting the use of symbols at certain places, certainly, and restricting ideology from being spread if there's a war going on. Now, America never really did a war against jihadism. And so in that case, it's a blurry case, but there's no question that is a complex issue. the use, say, of Islamic symbols in New York City in the wake of 9/11. Yeah, that's an issue in my mind, and a complex issue, one that can't be easily knocked aside. But outside of the context of a war, if we're not engaged in a war with the Nazis at the time, then there was a very famous case decades after the war, a Jewish community, Skokie, Illinois. Of course, the neo-Nazis wanted to do a parade right down the middle of Skokie, Illinois, a Jewish community, and they were restricted from doing so. The case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, no, if it's purely an ideological thing, the mere fact that they're denying the Holocaust or wearing swastikas, that's their freedom of speech. The Nazis have a right to a public demonstration, even in a Jewish community. And I have to totally agree with that. I have to totally agree with that. So long as we're not in active war against the Nazis, and that swastika isn't a recruitment of, you see, the other side, an active recruitment of force against you, as long as you can't make that justification, then I don't care how offensive it is.
Thank you. We have one last one, but before that, just the announcement. So tomorrow there's the Daily Objective at the same time, 6 p.m. UK time. And then there's Life on Earth at 10 p.m.
Yeah,
and now we have Phil for £5 asks a question to James. James, someone says to you, "Here's my gun, I'm going to shoot you." What would you be reasonably, lawfully able to do?
Use deadly force against him immediately. No, when there's a credible threat of death or great bodily injury, you may use the necessary force. This is standard common law of self-defense. The person who faces this imminent, immediate threat of physical force may use, now, obviously, if I'm, just a fist fight and I'm not, say, a professional boxer, and I just take a swing at you, you can't pull out a gun and shoot me. The force can be excessive. You may use the appropriate amount of force that's required. Now, let's say I'm a fragile person in a wheelchair and someone's just taking a punch at me. Well, now that can put me in the hospital. But if there is a reasonable and objective, and this is the language the law uses in England and the United States, if there is a reasonable, objective threat of physical force, you may use whatever force is reasonably necessary to meet it. And it's the objective appearance of the threat, not the actual reality of the threat either. If it appears to me, if let's say he pulls out a gun and although it's a toy gun, it looks just like a real gun, and he says, "I'm going to kill you," I can pull out a real gun and shoot him. I have that absolute right, because once threatened objectively and reasonably with death or great bodily injury, I can respond with deadly force. Absolutely. But you see, they're the words that were used when the guy points the gun. It's part of the physical threat, you see. He's pulled something that looks like a gun and used words. It's not the words in isolation that are ever being prosecuted, it seems to me. It's the words in the context of, it's a dark alley, I'm showing you what looks like a gun, I'm coming after you. It's the totality of the circumstances and the physical actions that the person is doing, which are part of that. So if words are, as I say, part of a crime, part of a initiation of physical force, then those words are part of the crime. It's not the words as such that we're going after. Does that make sense?
Yeah, those are all good points. The last case that I want to discuss today is one that I myself feel considerably conflicted over, and that's the Uju Anya case. This was discussed on a previous Daily Objective by Jonathan Honig back in September when Queen Elizabeth died. So Uju Anya is a professor at Carnegie Mellon University. She's a professor of critical sociolinguistics. And when it was announced that Elizabeth II was ill and was very likely going to die, Uju Anya tweeted something to the effect that she wished the Queen an excruciating death. I'm not sure if you remember that case. The context here is that she's from Nigeria and her family suffered a lot under the colonization by the British. Now, here's my conflict. I'm no fan of the British monarchy. It's an illegitimate institution that should have been abolished long ago. So I'm certainly no fan of the monarchy or any of the things that they've done. Having said that, there's something about that particular comment that strikes me as so vile and so repulsive that the thought passed through my mind, should a university even employ someone who expresses themselves in that way? But then I thought, well, but is that calling for somebody to be canceled by virtue of how they express themselves? So what are the implications here morally of?
This reminds me of an example you used earlier in our discussion where a person was getting fired at university for what they said. That is employment is an entirely different thing in my view. If you're working for a private employer, they can fire. Look, if you're at a university and you're denying the Holocaust, I don't think you're a good history professor. Just on the grounds of being a lousy historian, you fire that guy if he denies the Holocaust, right? I mean, that's not a violation of his freedom of speech. If a school fires a historian who's denying the Holocaust, that's a substantive no, dude. Or even if it's just an ethics teacher who's denying the Holocaust. You can understand a school firing someone for denying the Holocaust. That makes perfect sense. Similarly here, it is different when a person loses their job because of something so awful they said. If this lady lost her job because of the offensive thing she said, well, that's between her and her employer, in my view. Now, on the other hand, prosecuting her and putting her in jail seems wrong. I can understand her personal context, but Queen Elizabeth II oversaw the dismantling of the British Empire. If she actually put it in context, she'd realize Queen Elizabeth II was actually there she and her father were there on the ground as the British were taking their empire apart. Now, does that make everything that happened okay and not the fault of the British? But no, obviously it's irrational, however, to want this kindly old lady who really had no direct cause in any of the suffering Kenya had. However much you and I both oppose the monarchy, I'm a total Republican. I oppose the monarchy as an institution. British imperialism was not a pretty thing in Africa or India or in North America, by the way. But so I'm not a big fan in many cases of British imperialism. But all that having been said, right, it's totally offensive in my view and totally dropping context to wish an excruciating death on a kindly old lady. On that level alone, I take offense at that. As much as I can even understand the psychology of maybe her own personal context, but in no way should it be criminally or civilly prosecutable, in my view.
It wasn't. I mean, the university made it clear that they wouldn't fire her or discipline her for her actions, which is, I mean, that's their prerogative. If I were a student or another professor at the university, I would certainly want nothing to do with a colleague or an instructor who expresses herself in those terms, in
such vicious, vile terms. Yeah, right. I mean, wanting the death of this kindly old lady who really had no personal responsibility in any of that, just wow. That's over the line morally for me. That's over the line in decency for me. However, it must be legal. It really must be legal, however offensive and ugly the statement, really.
And in fact, that ties in with the comment that we made just the other day about when we were talking about racial stereotypes, that no matter how offensive speech is, we can't really define it purely in subjective terms, in terms of somebody's emotional response to it, which actually leads to my final question. Hate crimes, is that a valid or an invalid concept?
Invalid concept.
The way it's used today.
Invalid concept. The discussion about, racially motivated or religiously motivated murder as opposed to a murder for money. Let's say I'm murdering you to get the inheritance I expect from you, or murdering you to get some financial advantage I expect. Is that not a hate crime? I mean, and is the crime murder? I mean, I can understand certain aggravants, but one thing I have a hard time doing is calling something a crime because it's this motive versus that motive. Motive is relevant in an evidentiary sense in a criminal case. Obviously, what was the motive for the person in doing that? If I have evidence of that, that tends to show they committed the crime. However, when it comes to motive in making it a crime, that's not what makes it a crime. What makes it a crime is not the kind of hate that it was, No, it's what you're doing that makes it, you're violating their right. You're killing somebody, you're shooting somebody. That's the crime. If it's intentional, if it's deliberate, if it's premeditated, that seems to be worse in my mind than, say, some extremely negligent firing off of a gun during a holiday or something. So, on that level, intent matters. Intent does matter to me. On the other hand, the motive for committing the crime shouldn't be what makes it a crime. What makes it a crime is you shot the guy, you fired off the gun, you violated someone's rights with force. That's what makes it a crime, not parsing these motives. And then what we're doing too is think of it, we're going down a list of, well, this motive is worse than that motive, which is worse than this motive, which is worse than, no. Murder bad, right? Intentional premeditated murder is all really, 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 really bad. If we're parsing out, well, this guy was more racist than this guy, I think we've lost our way entirely on what murder is and what we're after in our criminal justice system.
It's interesting. If you look up the term hate crimes or hate speech in an older dictionary, say, and the term really only goes back to the 80s and 90s where it became common currency. But looking it up in, say, the Oxford Dictionary, the Cambridge Dictionary, it actually defines it in terms of incitement of violence or prejudice against a particular group, which is, of course, what we talked about at the very beginning of this discussion, incitement of violence or that people should be denied their rights. But that's not the way people use the term hate speech today. They use the term hate speech to describe anything that any particular group describes as offensive. And of course, nowadays, there's this whole generation, this younger generation, that seems to be making it a profession to take offense to absolutely everything.
Offense, exactly, to everything. And to their your hair trigger when it comes to being offensive. And their feelings, you hurt their feelings, that's it. You know, that's a crime. They got to stop that, no matter how, you know, mind you, at Stanford Law School just the other day in my country, law students shouted down a judge, a federal judge who had been invited to speak there, making it impossible for that judge to give a speech to law students. Now, you want a federal judge? I mean, we'd be lucky at our law school, right, to have a federal judge come in and tell you his perspective. They shouted him down because their feelings were hurt, and the dean actually stood up and encouraged what was, I'm so offended, I'm so triggered. Wait a minute here. I want my lawyers to be able to take whatever offensive words there are. And if you're so eggshell thin that you can't, that you're so offended and harmed by a conservative judge coming to speak at your law school, you're disqualified as a lawyer, in my view. Those people have no business going into that field. But even just an adult human being, forget the law school context, just an adult human being. We got to grow up, folks. These are just words. However much we're offended by someone's politics, I regard philosophy as the cause. I mean, I'll tell you that I think Immanuel Kant was a rotten guy. He helped cause the Holocaust, but he was just a pencil pusher. He was just a quiet old professor. There's nothing the law can do about Immanuel Kant, even if I had this X-ray vision and could show at the time that this would lead to Hitler. Like Bigoff proves in the ominous parallels. No, even if I had the ominous parallels and then 10 ominous parallels, would that give the law a reason to censor Kant or Hegel? No, it's just words, people. We got to get over this thing where my emotions getting affected is the same as getting hit, punched, or shot. Physical force is a different category, and it is the category which morally justifies the government in taking action. Emotional offense can never be sufficient.
Very good point. Irene, do we have any final super chats before we wrap up?
No, all good.
Okay, excellent. James, thank you for another fabulous discussion. It's been a great pleasure, and I look forward to talking to you very soon. Thanks, everyone. Remember to support the excellent work that the Ayn Rand Center UK is doing. Make a donation, join and become a member, and enjoy more excellent, enlightening content like this discussion. James, thank you very much once again.
Thank you, sir. Take care.
Thank you. Goodbye.